Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Empty Promises, Cautious Optimism, and Total Uncertainty episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. In November 2022, for the South Africa update, we'll be looking at the Commission for Gender Equality report on President Ramaphosa's 2020 public announcement that government would allocate 40% of public procurement expenditure towards women enterprises, the 2022 MTBPS, and the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan. In the Africa Regional Update, we look at the inauguration of Lesotho's new Prime Minister, the Ethiopian peace agreement between the Federal Government and the TPLF, and the concerns over the peace process in Eastern DRC. And in the Global Geopolitics Update, we'll be looking at the EU Digital Services Act, the US Fed raising rates, and COP27. With me this episode is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this month?
Hi this year. No, man, I'm well, thank you. It's just that we are having load shedding again, which is blackouts. Over this weekend we had stage 4 blackout, and on Sunday we were told that they would be doing something. So instead of going down to stage 3, they've actually increased it to stage 5 blackouts. So there's something wrong with the management at Eskom, our power utility. So it's just everybody is irritated, and we just keep getting promises. So I hope I don't sound irritated tonight. So yeah.
It is the Empty Promises episode of our podcast, and so it's so fitting. It's quite sad that things are actually getting worse, and whilst our load shedding situation is getting worse in South Africa, government seemingly is expected to make further commitments to turn off our coal power plants amidst an energy supply crisis. I wonder when things will ever get better for the country.
Yeah, we wait in vain.
Yeah. On that note, a reminder to all our listeners, on whatever platform you're listening through, please hit the subscribe button to get up-to-date updates on all future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share the episode amongst your family and friends. On that note, let's go straight into it. In the South Africa update for this month, there's a lot happening. In the SA update in brief, the National Infrastructure Plan 2050 Phase 2 has been published for comment on the 25th of October. The SIU welcomed the arrest of former Eskom executive Mashela Koko and 7 others on the 28th of October. Meanwhile, President Cyril Ramaphosa conducted a state visit to Kenya on the 8th of November, and the Pretoria High Court dismissed the Trade Union Solidarity's application against the Department of Health implementing the National Health Insurance on the 9th of November. And the Regional Banking Dialogue for Sub-Saharan Africa was held in Cape Town on the 9th and 10th of November. And the inaugural National Presidential SMME and Cooperatives Awards were held in Bryanston on the 13th of November. Sbu?
Why there are all of these presidential awards? We have many of them. I don't know why we keep patting ourselves on the back as if there's something wonderful that's happening, whereas we're skipping on we're running on one spot and we're not moving as a country. But anyway, people like awards, like all these accolades and to dress up. But yeah.
Very, very true. We were not making any progress at all, and it's quite concerning. And as you say, it's almost as though we're stuck on a treadmill running in the same place.
Yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the first story in the SA update, a promise without commitment. So the Commission for Gender Equality, the CGE, launched a report titled A Promise Without Commitment, an overview of state compliance with President's 40% procurement allocation, which examines and assesses the compliance and implementation of the President's target. Now, the study has found that the levels of expenditure by department and related entities in procuring goods and services from black women-owned businesses consistently amounted to only a fraction of the overall procurement expenditure. At a national level, it's only the Department of Traditional Affairs and the Provincial Department of Finance in Mpumalanga which exceed the 40% target, which remains an isolated incident rather than the norm. Sbu?
Yeah, well, does the presidency really have a department of monitoring and evaluation? I wonder. I've just got questions. Now, if it does, who's supposed to evaluate their own performance? Because to me, they're not performing at all. You've got all of these issues, you've got the youth participation issue within the economy. The government have got all of these policies and regulations, but nothing seems to come out. So youth are not participating, and there's women are not participating. Then you also have got the payment of government suppliers within 30 days. They make all of these commitments, and no one holds anyone to account. And I wonder who's following up on the implementation of the Auditor General's reports. Who follows up? Is there any? What does that department do? Monitoring and evaluation, because people don't adhere to illegal outcomes. These departments don't adhere to legal outcomes. Whenever there's a case, the judgment would be, you department so and so will do this, that, and the other, but no one ever follows up. If you want to talk about a lawless society, you start with the government itself. The government departments do not pay for if there is supposed to be any kind of compensation for health reasons. For an example, people get, our health departments are, no one gets wrapped over the knuckles, or nothing ever happens. I don't want to paint a gloomy scenario, but this is exactly what happens. We have all of these nice policies and policy frameworks and but nothing ever gets done. No one is held accountable.
Yeah, very, very concerning. And it doesn't really give one any confidence that despite all the realizations we've made as a country and all that's come to light in terms of state capture, etc., that the problems will ever get resolved. The level of impunity is very, very discouraging, and actually encourages people, especially those who are in the waiting rooms of political succession, to continue down the same path of graft and corruption, because they don't expect there to be any repercussions for any of their actions. And it's very, very, very concerning. And I think this is also one of those things where the president just makes commitments without any plan of implementation, and there's nobody really who picks up on a lot of these determinations. You'll remember a couple of episodes back that we've discussed at length some of the commitments that the president's made in terms of youth job creation. He has set the target at 1 million jobs over and over, and I doubt they've even been able to crack at least 20% of that in terms of the jobs created, at least not on a long-term basis, as far as I can tell from what's in the public domain. So yeah, I think it's one of those, and I think at the next polls, voters, I think, will hold the ruling party and the president accountable. And I think it's about time we start having a lot of implementation of all this talk and commitments that we constantly seem to be getting from the ruling elite. On that note, that takes us to the second story in the essay update. The 2022 MTBPS. South Africa's Minister of Finance delivered the 2022 Medium-Term Budget Policy Statement, MTBPS, which provides for spending adjustments to continue rebuilding livelihoods and infrastructure following devastating flood damage earlier this year. The MTBPS also makes policy and regulatory changes aimed at creating a competitive energy market, including the removal of the licensing threshold for embedded generation projects representing over 9,000 megawatts of capacity, and the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill, which provides for the establishment of an independent transmission and systems operator. The government of Gauteng and national government have also agreed to share 30 and 70% of SANRAL's debt and interest obligations related to the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project. The national government will also take over a third to two-thirds of Eskom's 400 billion rand debt bill. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
I mean, these MTBPS changes mentioned, I'm talking about the Eskom and SANRAL debt, are just about the only changes worth mentioning in this entire statement. One has to point out that the financing of state-owned enterprises in South Africa is premised on a market fundamentalist philosophy. In the commercialization of government companies, the role of the shareholder, which is the state, the South African government, when it comes to things like capital expenditure, was neglected, or in fact, in their strategy, they misdiagnosed that part. As a result, these state companies became heavily indebted because of the funding model, which relies on prevailing loan interest rates in the capital markets. I welcome the state intervention. I mean, to lighten the load on the balance sheets of these companies. Now, will this make a difference so late in the day? I highly doubt it, because just now we were talking about operational matters when it comes to Eskom. So anyway, my other observation is that the medium-term budget policy statement failed to address other structural challenges facing the country. Talking about stagnant economic growth, because last year, 2 years ago, the National Treasury issued an economic recovery and reconstruction policy, which has failed spectacularly. I mean, we're talking about, we're currently talking about economic growth rates of less than 2%. There's no intervention in this current budget statement. There was no intervention when it comes to things like income distribution. One would have thought that the SRD grant, which is meant for people who can't find work, will have been at least bumped up a little bit, or many other economists were hopeful that they would double that, but that hasn't happened. Basically, the country is expected to hobble along, carry on as if we are not facing a crisis. So, yeah, it was quite a disappointment, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, look, in many ways, I think there are certain things, obviously, the MTBPS cannot do. I think it's largely a correction. I think the agenda is pretty much set by the time the national budget is approved in February at the beginning of the year. But I agree with you. I think a large part of the MTBPS really just sort of pushes us along. And I think the aim, at least with some of the main decisions by government on the policy side, taking some of the Eskom debt, taking some of the provincial debt in terms of SANRAL, etc., doesn't really begin to even touch the surface on some of the structural issues. And I think rightly so, your observation and criticism of the economic recovery plan that was published by National Treasury, I think a year or two ago, has failed spectacularly. They haven't even been able to deliver on one of the key issues, especially around the issues of the delivery of spectrum, etc. Yes, obviously some of these things don't fall under National Treasury's control, But the idea is that all on that plan alone needs to be reviewed as to whether, or actually how much of it has actually been implemented in terms of the economic recovery plan. And looking at the actual economic performance, it actually goes and tells a story that it's been quite poor implementation on that economic recovery plan. But I think I'm not certain what the long term plan. I think they're pushing ahead with the privatization of ESCOM. I think this, to me, forms part of much broader geopolitical shifts we've seen. Obviously, a lot of commitments by advanced economies to shut down their coal power plants, etc., moving towards renewables, and there is this push towards renewables driven by the WEF agenda, etc. And I think South Africa is just being dragged along on this. And it's ironic that a lot of the advanced economies are already doubling back in terms of the commitments they made. For example, in the US, where commitments have been made for the past 3 to 5 years by Biden and even under the previous regime, that they would be shutting down coal power plants and driving towards renewables, has failed, dramatically. Same thing in European countries. And so I don't know, when a country faced with severe load shedding and power cuts, we're still going ahead with this despite the reality in the actual country, which is endowed with huge deposits of coal, etc., which could be used in the transition as opposed to just turning off the lights overnight, which seemingly is the direction that the government is following in line with the global WEF agenda.
Yeah, yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the third story in the essay update: South Africa's JETP-IP. South Africa's cabinet endorsed the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan, the JETP-IP, and expressed its appreciation of the detailed work undertaken to develop it. According to the JETP-IP, South Africa will need approximately $98 billion over the next 5 years to enable a just transition and achieve the targets set out in the nationally determined contribution. The JETP-IP includes a portfolio of investments across the electricity sector, green hydrogen, and new energy vehicles. Particularly, the JETP-IP focuses on investing in electricity transmission and distribution networks and expanding renewable energy sources. At COP27, South Africa, France, and Germany signed loan agreements for 600 million euros in concessional financing to support the JETP-IP. Smoo?
Yeah, 98 billion times almost 20 in South African rands. You just, the amounts that they're talking about, these people. Anyway, see, South Africa will not achieve any of its targets, not its own determinations, because these are dependent on the benevolence of others. I mean, the country has basically come out with a begging bowl the size of a bathtub, because what they're saying is that, I mean, like the numbers you mentioned, work out to something like $20 billion per annum. That's a huge amount in South African rands. For 5 consecutive years, yeah, in foreign donations. I mean, minimal grants and concessional loans. It's all a pipe dream. My view is that the government will rely on private sector funding, mainly because they erroneously believe that the state is over indebted. We've talked about this all on many accounts, that the state can fund its own capital expenditure if it wanted to, if there was enough political will. Okay, this JETP, this Just Energy Transition investment plan, is premised on the country's investment plan, because the country has an investment plan already. And there is an over-reliance on attracting foreign direct investment for infrastructure investments. This is where South Africa's plan falls flat on its face, in my opinion, because from the onset, this is, I mean, it's almost unfathomable that we'll be getting something like 200 more than 200 billion per annum from foreign direct investors. But then this is a global phenomenon. It's called by some economists the Wall Street consensus, also known as the de-risking state. What actually pertains in South Africa as it is, because as you know, the renewable power producer program that we have in the country, and I think we are on bid window 5 currently. You have the South African government shelling out all of these hundreds of billions in guarantees to de-risk private enterprise. And in most cases, these firms are foreign companies. So we are de-risking private enterprise. So my view is that the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan is a mega privatization plan. We will be basically privatizing the entire our entire energy infrastructure. So you can also, if you look at it, they're talking about 600 million euros, yeah, in concessional financing. That's a measly loan by these Western developed countries, because the main thrust will come not from those governments, not in the form of like reparations for all the harm that they've done to the climate, but what they'll be doing is that they'll be sending us to global capital markets. It's their European capital markets that will benefit the most. They will come in and fund at interest, at a profit, basically. So this is the privatization of South Africa, the real privatization of South Africa. Anyway, yeah, those are my strong views there. Yeah,
100%, bro. Look, we spoke about this in the first story. I mean, these guys are going ahead with the the just transition, and it's not even a just transition. We can't even call it that. We're basically going ahead with privatizing energy in the country, and the expectation is that renewables will take up everything, and we'll transition from coal to renewables overnight. In the next 5 years, we're looking with what, close to $100 billion. That's, in your estimates, if we assume about 20 rand per dollar or around abouts, we're talking over 1.6 to 2 trillion rands that we need to take on in debt over the next 5 years. Just in relative terms, we're talking already 5 times as much debt that there is currently at Eskom. So let's unpack what we mean by, triple Ps. And I think you're right. This is just basically government de-risking the privatization of the energy sector, which is quite sad because, when people talk about triple Ps or public-private partnership with the expectation that it's going to come from private monies, they're typically talking a partnership between a private entity and a state-owned entity. And given the guarantees that are going out not only directly to the state-owned entities, but also to a lot of these bid windows, as you rightfully put, government is actually the one that's financing this privatization. And its actual fact is that let's not fool ourselves. If this just transition falls apart and there are private entities that need to be bailed out, or the triple Ps need to be bailed out, as was what we've seen with the slow implementation and the slow investment in new generation capacity at Eskom, we can expect that the government will have to come and foot the bill if this just transition and the bid windows start failing. And my biggest concern is that through all of this, we keep making huge plans and huge, ambitious goals of $100 billion over the next 5 years that we need in order to invest in transition. But there's literally not even a mention of, currently where we are and what the role of coal and other carbon-based energies will do and how we're going to phase that out. All we seem to be doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to actually just target a specific generation mix where renewables are the dominant source of energy, and then cost that and decide that the country must move there. But the core of the issue is, how do you transition? How do you move from where we are as you cross this river, moving from one stone to the next, and there's no planning at all. It's just sort of daydreams, really. And even this little carrots that they dangling, 600 million euros, it's a pittance. It's not even 1% of the $100 billion that we need. You're talking concessional financing of less than 1%. I mean, it's a shocker. It's a shocker. Look, what we are running towards as a country, and I think this is also linked globally, is firstly is the end of free carbon-based energy for the masses, right? And whether this is driven by environmental impact, climate change, or whatever, my bigger concern is that when people can't afford energy and when the renewable energy proves itself as unreliable, because of where the technological constraints and everything is as we are currently, this will be leading us to a much more severe problem. Like, if we're worried about the theft of your transmission infrastructure now, and the theft and organized syndicates that are attacking South African infrastructure, public infrastructure, and that's happening now, you can definitely believe that as you roll out this new renewables infrastructure and the associated transmission, etc., that too will be the target of the criminality. And if we expect the masses not to be able to have access to cheap, affordable energy, you can bet yourself that they will be selling a lot of what's supposed to be rolled out as scrap metals and trying to make ends meet as we head very, very fast towards an energy crisis, which could blow out to be a kind of social crisis the way I see it. And I'm worried that nobody's really checking the temperature, and nobody's really speaking about the huge elephants in the room that we just seemingly are ignoring as a country and as policymakers, drag us along down this path. And look, I'm far from climate change denialists or people who are denying that this transition is going to last, or that they seemingly that this is just a flavor of the month. I understand that the general geopolitics is driving us down this path, but I would much rather be comfortable if the country was taking its own interest and making decisions based on that, rather than the interests of global capital markets, which are just looking for yield, really. In the post-pandemic period, after the US has injected over $6 trillion into capital markets, and now is dealing with hyperinflation whilst also looking for yield. And that's why the energy sector is being attacked from all angles. And because it's a catastrophe and it's in shambles currently, there's an energy supply crisis both globally and in the country. People are kind of starved for solutions, and whatever is put on the table seems viable. And I'm worried that even what's being put on the table on its own merits, for me, is just not viable.
Yeah, and I would say, this it's a complex topic. That's why most people can't wrap their heads around the numbers and the magnitude of it all. So we need to unpack it piece by piece. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. And my bigger concern is this, right? So, okay, we're going to say we're taking, government's already stepping in to save ESCOM, right? 400 billion rand in debt. And the idea is that this debt is what's choking ESCOM. And I think it's not the case. What's really at stake is the mafias that are controlling ESCOM's supply chains and procurement, and forcing ESCOM to continue down a path of relying on what they currently rely on, the gas and the diesel purchases, etc. And, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at the problem if you cannot deal with the problem of criminality and the capture of these institutions. You're not going to resolve the problem. So now what we're saying is, okay, we're going to cost a transition away from the troubled ESCOM and put the actual energy in the hands of private investors, but you're just throwing 5 times as more money at the same problem, and you're hoping that through these IPPs that cutting out Eskom firstly, so you're not resolving Eskom's cash flow problem because you're actually taking away customers that could have been paying Eskom. At the same time, you're not resolving the problems that a captured Eskom is faced with, which is a resistance towards a transition generally, and you're putting that risk now at the face of private IPPs, which are much smaller and have much less authority and much less political power, at least in the public domain, and hoping that that's going to resolve the problem. I just don't see it. I really, really don't see it. On that note, that brings an end to the essay update for this month. And again, a reminder to all our listeners on whatever platform you're listening through, please hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all future episodes of Ubuntunomics podcast. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share the episode amongst your family and friends. On that note, that takes us to the Africa Regional Update for this month. In the Africa Regional Update in brief, the Lesotho Highlands Development Authority announced a start of Phase 2 of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project on the 7th of November, and the joint meeting of African Union ministers in charge of industry and economic diversification met on the 7th of November. And the Regional Off-Grid Electricity Access Project's second steering committee meeting was held on the 10th of November, and the Inter-Congolese dialogue is being held from the 4th to the 13th of November in Nairobi.
Okay, this Lesotho Highlands Development start of Phase 2. It's sort of like how, the way I see it, it's sort of like how China is accused of going into these small countries and doing the infrastructure build using their own firms, using their own materials, using their own funds, and benefiting, basically almost like privatizing those natural resources. Because what will happen is that we are privatizing, basically, not privatizing. I don't know whether to call it privatizing or nationalization, but we are getting the natural resources of Lesotho for little, for not so much. And what you'll find is that the little village in Lesotho will be without water, and all that water is flowing towards Gauteng, the Gauteng province. So Lesotho will benefit, of course, but South Africa benefits much, much more.
Sure. Look, I think that's a fair criticism, but I must admit that the Phase 2, I think, given the fact that they're now no longer just sort of exchanging their water for some energy, there'll be substantial generation capacity down the line. I think it's at Katse, Dram, that the Phase 2 project will unlock is quite significant. So I think in as much as, yes, I think the Basotho don't benefit as much, they will definitely have a much better benefit compared to Phase 1, given that they're not only just getting paid for the water, but also having electricity come out of the mix, which currently, given the limited generation capacity in the country, they're buying a lot of that from Eskom currently already. So I think it's an unfair deal, no doubt, but it is a better deal than the previous one at the very least.
Yes, okay.
But I agree with you. You don't seem too sold, but I agree with you. It is a bit of an unfair deal. But look, I guess those without capital to invest in themselves will always end up being the victims of those with the capital. Because, I mean, look at, for example, what South Africa and the rest of Africa is doing in this just transition, right? We are basically just going around with the begging bowl, looking to receive money from these advanced economies. The advanced economies are not going to give you money for nothing. Yes, they'll charge their interest rates, but more importantly, what they want is to actually capture the procurement on the back of giving you the financing. It's exactly what's happening in the case of South Africa or Lesotho and South Africa in the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, right? Because they know the country doesn't have the capital to develop its own infrastructure. They will take advantage. And it is South African firms that will benefit and South African citizens primarily. But if you are not developing your own capital and investing your own money in your own development, that's pretty much the deal you have to accept.
Yeah. Well, yeah, capital markets. Yeah, I think we've yeah. No, we've we've gone through this in previous episodes about how Africa needs to have its own development financing and blah blah blah. Yeah, you can't help it. It's the way it is. So
Yeah.
they'll have to grin and take it. Yeah.
No, definitely, definitely. On that note, that takes us to the first story in Africa Regional Update. Matekane inaugurated as the Prime Minister of Lesotho. So, Mr. Ntsokwane Samuel Matekane has been inaugurated as the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Lesotho after winning 56 of the 79 contested constituencies in the National Assembly elections that took place on the 7th of October. Mr. Matekane has vowed to be a true and faithful Prime Minister, emphasizing the importance of ensuring implementation of the reforms agenda and promised to uproot corruption whilst carrying forward the Lesotho We Want agenda. As promised, Prime Minister Matekane has appointed 15 new cabinet ministers, which cuts the number of ministries from 26 since he came into power. Sbu?
Well, yeah. I will say. I mean, the change of government without any untoward incidents has to be applauded. This is what is needed in the region. There should be seamless transition of political power, and I mean we should be turning that into a culture. Um, Now, will President Matakane be successful in ensuring the implementation of his reforms agenda to uproot corruption? Probably, you most probably will, but it'll be a great endeavor. And if it does, all kudos to him. Will will rooting out corruption lead to prosperity for Basotho? Probably not. In fact, I am certain of it. It won't. Much has been said about corruption, the fight against corruption, and I agree. Corruption robs the commons of their benefits from national budgets. I don't doubt this, but will say will the busting of corruption result in economic growth? No, it has not happened here in South Africa. It has not happened anywhere because it's an efficiency matter. You're dealing with efficiency, whereas the country needs economic growth. That's the real issue. And Lesotho is a reflection of South Africa. The high unemployment rates in South Africa are reflected in Lesotho. The high crime rates in South Africa are reflected in both in Lesotho and in South Africa, because Lesotho coming into South Africa and committing all sorts of crimes. So the main thing will be growing that economy so that you get returns, you get those benefits, societal benefits. So Mr. Matekane needs to reveal his plans on how we will grow the company. I mean, the economy over and above fighting crime, because corruption is crime fighting. It's not growth.
100%, 100%. Look, yeah, we do have this conflation between fighting crime and economic growth, and I agree with you. Dealing with the problem of criminality doesn't enable innovation and creativity, which is what is needed to spur economic growth. And I think we must be clear. Look, there definitely are benefits to reducing corruption and dealing with corruption. Corruption does cause leakages, but I always am reminded, to take a leaf from the book written by a Chinese writer, I think Yuan Ang. So she writes about China's Gilded Age, and the central problem she's trying to understand is how has China been able to achieve such high economic growth whilst still having relatively high levels of corruption in the country. And she points down to one thing, right? She says there are four kinds of corruption, and corruption is either speed money, you're trying to get that permit fast and trying to get into business activity, which is primarily the kind of corruption that China turns a blind eye towards. And then she goes and lists three additional kinds of corruption. Now, this is access money. Now, you're paying money in order to access power, influence money, etc. And I think these are all the kinds of corruption that are anti-economic growth and anti-innovation, because they entrench people's political powers, they entrench people's narrow and personal interests over the economic growth and the national interests of the country. And basically her conclusion in the case of China is that the kind of corruption that China has, or the kind of corruption that China encourages, is corruption that enables economic growth. And I think that's literally the nuance that a lot of African countries and African governments and leaders generally need to understand in our general fight against corruption on the continent. Crime fighting on its own is not going to solve all the developmental challenges we face. But I think we need to find more innovative ways and understand the impact of certain, norms, customs, and corruption being one of them, and how they impact on our livelihoods and the quality of life on the continent.
Agreed. Yes.
On that note, that takes us to the second story in the Africa Regional Update. The government of the FDRE reached a peace agreement with the TPLF. So the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the FDRE, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, signed the cessation of hostilities agreement, which signals a commitment to end the use of force to settle differences and disputes. The Secretary General of the United Nations has welcomed the signing of the agreement for lasting peace through a permanent cessation of hostilities between the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. The peace talks were facilitated by former Nigerian President His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo, the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa, former Kenyan President His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, and former South African Deputy President Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka. The peace agreement is the first crucial step towards ending the two-year conflict, which has led to loss of lives and livelihoods for many Ethiopians. Sbu?
Well, the armed conflict and the disputes in this case will cease because the one party lost this war. They lost that civil war. The TPLF were forced to sign. They had run out of military supplies, the ability to extract taxes from their citizens. Fuels had dried out. There were no fuel supplies into Tigray. Their equipment failures. I mean, governments had become run down. I mean, government hospitals had become run down. They had ammunition shortages, and most of all, the communication was cut off. So they had no access to the external world. So the Ethiopian government had squeezed the noose so tight that there was no other alternative but to sign and engage in those peace talks. Will nation building be sustained? That's the question. Will the issues that gave rise to the civil war be ironed out? I mean, the federal system will not be changed in Ethiopia. That's where the problem was. And the economic conditions in Tigray will take a long time to resolve, because there's lack of economic activity up north. Because on the one side, you've got Eritrea. Tigray is almost like a country that is landlocked. So I don't know how they will address all the problems facing that region. One is left with the question about the spoils of the war, though. By this, I mean the Ethiopian government were on their knees also before the military assistance from China, some Gulf states, Turkey came in also, and for all that support, they will have to make some concessions, and those countries will. I mean, Gulf countries have got large tracts of land in Ethiopia where they come in and do agriculture, and so yeah, it's a messy one, but peace is always good. It's a good thing. It's a good starting point, but there will be repercussions. There will be compromises. There will be people. There will be finger pointing. Yeah, but yeah, peace is good.
Sure, sure. Look, I think for me, one of the key lessons out of this is something that I think African leaders and military defense departments really need to take seriously, which is, the impact and the advantage given by drones in military strategy. I think what we've seen around the globe in a lot of contemporary conflicts is how drones are a huge game changer. They were the huge game changer in Ethiopia. They pretty much are what pushed back the TPLF after it had made commitments and was actually on its plan to march to Addis, right? And it was with the drone strikes that they were able to contain them and return them back into Tigray and contain the TPLF within the Tigrayan province or provincial region. And I'm just shocked and wondering, why aren't we doing the same thing in Eastern DRC? We keep sending all these envoys, whether it be through the UN missions or even bilateral or regional economic communities sending their contingents, when they could just be putting money aside and buying drones and sending the drones into Eastern DRC. Obviously, there are issues about being remote and access that have enabled that conflict in the Eastern DRC to last and continue up to where we are today. And it just surprises me that we're not learning from conflicts on other parts of the continent in order to resolve some of the huge conflicts that are holding us back as a continent. So I think, yes, it is a positive step in terms of reaching of a peace agreement in Ethiopia. I definitely agree with you that there will be bargains made, and we'll have to see who is the actual beneficiary of the spoils of the war. But I would love to see how African countries and African leaders integrate learnings from the Tigrayan issue into resolving the problems in the Eastern DRC. For me, I want to see that being implemented, particularly given that this is probably one of the longest lasting conflicts on the continent.
Maybe the reason is that the Eastern DRC is forested. It's equatorial, so there is cover, and so you. Whereas in Tigray, it's a plateau. Those are highlands, and so there's not much. There's not many trees. There's not much cover because. You can have all those drones, but if people are hiding beneath the forest cover, the tree line, I think that's the it will be a little bit different. I think I'm not a war strategist though.
Sure. No, I think point taken. But I think, yes, there is limitations given the vegetation in the region. But for example, Kenya some years back had a serious problem with Al Shabaab insurgents coming through from Somalia, and they were able to then corner them in the forest, in the the Boni National Reserve and the Lag Bana Bush National Park in Somalia. Obviously, there were some challenges and concerns over the environmental impact of some of the airstrikes that were being run by the Kenyan government. But at the end of the day, that those strikes were able to decisively deal with the problem of Al Shabaab, at least in the northeastern parts of Kenya. So I agree with you to some extent that, yeah, this does play out slightly different given the different geography. But I do think that, the drones and the artillery strikes are definitely an advantage in the conflicts around the world. And I would just love to see how we integrate that and use that on conflicts on the continent, given that, we've got these long drawn out conflicts that cannot be resolved with infantrymen or boots on the ground, and I think require different types of military strategy and not just the conventional, warfare that we've been engaged with up to this point.
Yes. Point taken.
On that note, that takes us to the last story in Africa Regional Update, the concerns over peace processes in Eastern DRC. Now, the Summit of the East African Community, the EAC heads of state, held a high-level consultative meeting on the peace process in Eastern DRC on the sidelines of the COP27 conference in Egypt, with the view to resolve and strengthen the political track in processes towards peace in Eastern DRC. Now, this follows the African Union expressing extreme concern at the deteriorating security situation in eastern provinces of the DRC, and the chairperson of the Summit of the East African Community, the President of the Republic of Burundi, His Excellency Evariste Ndayishimiye, and the East African Facilitator on Peace in the Eastern DRC, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, set out for Kinshasa for a high-level consultation with the DRC's President Felix Tshisekedi on the 13th and the 14th of November. The chairperson of the East African Community committed that all 7 EAC partner states will now be fully involved with the process, with each head of state forwarding a technical advisor to support the facilitator on the EAC peace process. And the heads of state from Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania reiterated their commitment to contribute to the East African Special Fund for the implementation of the peace process, and urged all partner states to sustainably support the facility. Currently, the AU and the International Conference on the Great Lakes Region, the ICGLR, have contributed to the East African Community Special Fund for the implementation of the peace process. Sbu?
Yeah, I like funds. Funds, the funds oil the wheels, So I like the notion of a special fund. But this is one of the most intriguing, drawn out conflicts. The countries tasked with implementing the peace process are all party to the conflict, except for, say, Tanzania. Even Kenya is used as a transit point for the illegal mineral export market. That's where these guys will go through Rwanda and straight for Nairobi, and then some of these things get flown out. So even the other countries have either combatants or they have proxies on the ground in the Eastern DRC. So they are part of the problem. I agree with the notion of Africa resolving its own problems, but in this case, a totally neutral partner is needed for lasting peace to be established. When I look around, I think regional bodies from, say, South America could come in and do a better job than, say, the UN, which have been there for more than a decade and done nothing, and they became part of the problem. The AU is toothless, we all know, and we can't go to China because they are also, Chinese companies in the DRC mining all of these minerals. We can't say the EU because the EU is also involved. These planes that fly in to all those airfields in the Eastern DRC and take out all of those minerals all from the EU. And Russia, Russia has got mercenaries in Central Republic because they've got interest. So everyone has an interest, it seems, because that part of the world must be the most the richest property in the entire world. So what happens is that we're sending hyenas to negotiate peace amongst between the sheep flocks. So it won't work. I mean, I don't see how this one working. Yeah.
Most definitely. Now, I think you're coming to what is unique about the DRC conflict. I think, unlike the Tigrayan issue and perhaps in the Kenyan issue, where you've got perhaps only two state actors or non state actors involved, or bilateral issues between Somalia and Kenya, or even civil issues in the case of Ethiopia. Here you've got multiple players and also neighboring countries who are also have vested interest in the conflict continuing. And I think you rightfully state, the issue with the huge partners who are involved in the conflict. I mean, China was the biggest contingent of the UN mission that was been there for over 2 decades. They've contributed the majority of the boots on the ground and also have vested interest given the Chinese firms extracting minerals in the region. And similarly with the EU, as you rightfully put, and I think it was 2 months ago, if not a month ago, that I think it was an Italian ambassador to the DRC who got killed in Eastern DRC after he was going in there unprotected and dealing in minerals. So all these players with vested interest, and I think you have a good point there in saying that perhaps a neutral player would be the best in this case. It's just that obviously countries in South America are usually competitors to the DRC. If you take, for example, Peru in terms of copper exports, etc. And so even they also might be sort of secondary beneficiaries of the conflict, given that they are competing for the same markets that the DRC would be exporting its minerals to. It's just that, quite sad that given the vested interest involved and the people who are supposedly mediating this conflict, they all have a vested interest in the conflict continuing unresolved, given that they then get to benefit from this chaos. I had high hopes, really, when the DRC joined the East African community that perhaps now they will be able to get all the parties involved around the table in order to have decisive action around the issue of peace and security in Eastern DRC. But again, the vested interests are really what's getting in the way of a peaceful resolution to the conflicts in the Eastern DRC.
Did I mention that the US is also there?
Of course. They've been there for a long time. From the assassinations that they've run in the DRC, etc. Yeah, they've been there for a long time.
Okay. Yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update, and that takes us to the Global Geopolitics Update. The Global Geopolitics Update in brief: Lula inaugurated as the President of Brazil on the 31st of October. The G20 Leaders Summit was held in Bali in Indonesia on the 15th and 16th of November. Republicans regained control of the House of Representatives following the 2022 US midterms on the 17th of November. Meanwhile, Ukraine falls out with allies in the West over the missile explosion in Poland on the 17th of November. And the FIFA World Cup in Qatar kicks off today on the 20th of November.
There's been much talk about that World Cup in Qatar, especially about workers from developing countries who've gone in there to build all those stadiums. I mean, this is said to be the most expensive World Cup ever, but these guys were working in horrible conditions where temperatures would rise as high as close to 50 degrees Celsius. So many of them died of building those stadiums. So yeah, and there's also other issues about religion and all of that, and no beer. I mean, this will be the first World Cup where people don't come in and drink and support their teams. Yeah, so yeah, interesting.
On that note, that brings us to the first story in the Global Geopolitics segment. The EU DSA enters into force. The European Union's Digital Services Act, the DSA, which includes rules for a safer and more accountable online environment, entered into force. The DSA applies to all digital services that connect consumers to goods, services, or content. The DSA key goals are to be proportionate, foster innovation, growth, and competitiveness, and facilitating the scaling up of smaller platforms, SMMEs, and startups. The DSA introduces a comprehensive new set of rules for online intermediary services on how they have to design their services and procedures. Now, the new rules include the new responsibilities to limit the spread of illegal content and illegal products online, increase the protection of minors, give users more choice and better information. Online platforms now have 3 months to report the number of active users on their websites before the 23rd of February 2023. After being designated according to size, online platforms will have 4 months to comply with the obligations under the DSA, including carrying out and providing to the Commission the first annual risk assessment exercise.
When Elon Musk bought Twitter, he was raving on, going on about free speech and all of that. And one guy from the EU said, "You can do all of that, but not here in the EU. We will regulate you." So I don't know. Yeah, to be interesting to find out more about this.
Yeah, look, I think this is one of those big stories that have a significant impact that affects everyone, but are probably not so well known in the public domain. I think for me, what regulators are now faced with is how to enable or allow free speech for users whilst also finding ways to regulate, online platforms to limit the things such as the illegal information and content, and even the divisive, or even the fake information, basically. And so regulators are finding it tough to satisfy free speech whilst also regulating these online platforms. And at the same time, they're seemingly finding it more and more difficult to control these mega giants. For example, recent admissions by Google that even if you do turn off their tracking services on the Android phones, that they still continue to track you and track and use your data, and all these violations of privacy, which seemingly the slaps across the wrist and the fines that these companies are being paid are not enough to deter them from continuing with these illegal activities. So yeah, it's one of those regulatory attempts that are trying to balance all these competing interests while also trying to control these digital powerhouses resulting from the spread and the popularity of social media.
Yeah, and Donald Trump is saying he's got his own that yeah. So yeah, okay, yeah.
Good luck and good riddance.
Yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the second story in the Global Geopolitics segment. The US Fed raises rates by 75 basis points. Now, the United States Federal Reserve Monetary Policy Committee decided to raise rates by 75 basis points, increasing the target range for Federal Reserve Funds rates to 3.75 to 4%. The committee anticipates that the ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. Currently, US inflation remains elevated at 6.2% in September 2022 from 6.2% a month before, against a target of below 2% inflation as set by the US Fed. Smoo?
My view is that only the US fits the perfect description where aggregate demand can be dampened by raising interest rates, where inflation is not imported in their case. I'm not one who favors using monetary policy to fix structural or supply chain constraints. But in this case, yeah, I say this because loan extensions for households in the US continue to increase. Household debt has soared at the fastest pace in 15 years, with a drastic surge in credit card usage and mortgage balances. Credit card balance collectively jumped by more than 15%. Yeah, it was the largest annual jump in 20 years. So that's according to the New York Fed. So the increase is due to a combination of robust consumer demand in the States and higher prices, with the one fueling the other. As more people, as inflation goes up, people go out and get more debt, and it's a spiraling thing. So the inflation is not entirely imported, not in the same way as the rest of the world. Um, so there are fears now that in some quarters that the U.S. Fed can go up, say by about another 100 basis points, and to quell this inflation, once and for all. And this will have serious impact on all of us throughout the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those stories where I worry because the US sneezes and we all catch a cold. I think this is where we find ourselves. My biggest worry, though, is that I think, in as much as, yes, I think the US does fit a caricature, economy where the interest rate tool as a monetary policy tool can still remain effective in controlling demand. My bigger concern is that the problem with inflation currently is not demand driven, right? It's a supply chain issue, like you say. It's a supply chain that have broken down post COVID, but also supply chains that have been affected by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? And there's no amount of interest rate hikes which will actually have an impact on that. Obviously, the onset of inflation in the US is also driven by the expansionary monetary policy over the last 2 years, where they pumped over $6 to $8 trillion in the economy at a time when supply chains were broken as they are now. So, yes, they may be able to mop up that extra liquidity in the US markets, but my bigger concern is that this is also going to mop up, the extra little dollars that still remain in capital markets. And South Africa, as a country that is looking, for example, to capture these global capital flows, will be stuck having to follow the US monetary policy lead, right? They will also have to raise interest rates in order to remain attractive to capital markets that are looking for yield. And so, as rates increase in the US, so too will they need to increase in the rest of the developing world, at least those that are market driven or that are market access economies. And the commitments from the U.S. side on raising rates has been very clear. Powell has been very, very strong in terms of saying that it's not a matter of how far or how much further rates can increase. It's a matter of how fast they'll be raising in order to respond to inflation moving forward. And again, although this might be useful to dampen demand in the US, inflation isn't caused by demand in this instance. But at the same time, even in the perfect world, right, this tool, monetary policy tool of interest rates, is actually what leads to further inequality, in my view, mainly because the consumers and the mass population relies on debt for consumption. By raising interest rates, you put them in further debt. But at the same time, those with capital and who own the productive means in the economy gain as the assets that they own raise, or the value of their assets continues to increase. And so, in as much as you'll be able to resolve the excess demand problem, you're actually facing a bigger problem down the line with rising inequality, rising homelessness in the United States, and the potential for serious public unrest. And the same applies in the rest of the world as this ripple effect starts affecting other economies that are hoping to gain some of these international global capital flows and attracting them through higher interest rates.
Yeah, squeezing out the middle classes, yes, definitely.
Most definitely. On that point, that brings us to the last story in the geopolitics segment. COP27 held in Egypt. And the United Nations Climate Change Conference for 2022, commonly known as the 27th Conference of Parties, COP27, was held in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, from 6th to the 18th of November. Countries came together to take action towards achieving the world's collective climate goals as agreed under the Paris Agreement and the Convention, and heads of state and government attended the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Implementation Summit on 7 and 8 November, and a high-level segment primarily attended by ministers took place from 15 to 18 November. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Man, there's no political will. The little there is will not be enough. My view is that the Conference of Parties will go down as the worst in the past 27 years. There's little consolation, though, in that there was talk about the climate change, about climate change reparations, but nothing concrete came out of it. Then another issue was that there was the decision to establish the Loss and Damage Fund. And this fund now will assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. But now finer details will become apparent as the fund gets operationalized. What is clear is that trust has been lost over the past 9 months or so, because binding commitments made at COP26 to reduce greenhouse emissions were neglected, especially as the war in the Ukraine and the ensuing energy crisis gripped the world. So there simply has been little appetite from political leaders to deliver on the 1.5 degree Celsius limit. This work will now be left to corporates and global capital markets to push forward. As I alluded to in the first story about the just energy transition, the funding of this green agenda to decarbonize cannot be left to the vagaries of the markets. I mean, COP27 was basically about the rolling out of the Wall Street consensus. It is no wonder that our South Africa chose this event to unveil its just energy transition investment plan. My view is that we need to see more engagement from central banks. I mean, central banks were not there. Central governors were not there. We need to see several sovereign wealth funds also coming in strongly. I mean, the central banks could come in with mandatory frameworks to sort of like enforce decarbonization, especially funders, banks, and institutional investors. They should come in there. Wealth funds could also start shift their capital towards greener projects. Talking about corporates, the most hilarious thing is that still in 2022, we have the world's worst polluters who come in as the main sponsors of these COP events. I'm talking about companies like Coca-Cola, which is the world's worst plastic polluter. But they come in and sponsor the event. And then you've got countries that mainly export oil who sponsor the event. I mean, one of the Gulf states, I'll mention them, Saudi Arabia, for example. They came in with a negotiator who negotiated that there should be no targeted energy sources. Rather, we should have targets on emissions. South Korea, for example, said they wanted, in addition to the wording, to say that and other clean energies. Most of us know that what they mean is that they want nuclear power to be slotted in as part of the decarbonization, which is not a bad idea, but there are all these conflicting interests and people with power, with a lot of money. I mean, when you're talking about Saudi Arabia is the biggest foreign direct investor in renewable energy in South Africa. So yeah, I mean, it's this. I mean, we should watch this. What's happening? This space is interesting. It's global politics and geopolitics is, yeah. Yeah.
Most
Anyway,
definitely.
thanks. Yeah.
It's scary though for me, right? Because these problems getting bigger and they require global solutions. However, it's almost as though at every opportunity when the world should be learning how to come up with global solutions, we just get caught up in private interests all over again. We saw this with the COVID 19 pandemic, where the advanced economies were hoarding vaccines. Africa and other developed regions hardly got any vaccines. I mean, on the continent, if you're looking outside of South Africa and perhaps Egypt and other, middle income countries, the vaccine rates are below 30 or below 40%. And, you know, despite this inequality, we've been able to contain the COVID 19 pandemic, but that was unnecessary. Advanced economies hoarding twice, if not three times, the vaccines that they need for their own populations at the expense of other poorer countries having access to it. Every time we get an opportunity to have a look at things both from efficiency but also equity, we completely fail. And again, whilst we should be looking at equitable ways to encourage investment in renewables for small and low income countries, whether that be through, bonds that are about compensating countries for pollution caused by advanced economies. Instead, we're just trying to find ways to secure the interests of advanced economies by forcing developing countries to access financing from these countries, to also access supplies from these countries, when in fact there could be much more equitable ways in ensuring that the advanced economies pay for the pollution that they've caused and setting us back the way they've done, whilst also enabling the investment in renewables for countries without the capital to invest in them. But again, we're failing ourselves. So it's sad that, in this dire situations that we're in problems that are geopolitical and global and require global solutions, we're still being driven by provincial, national, and private interests at the expense of everyone's life and the planet as a whole, really.
Yeah. And the leaders that we choose, I mean, the leaders that countries choose, they are they lean towards the usual suspects. They yeah,
Always,
yeah.
always. On that note, it brings an end to the Global Geopolitics segment for this month. And that takes us to the numbers game.
Yeah. Today's another day. Yeah. Let's come. What do you have for me?
So the number for this episode is set for a near 2% increase in third quarter 2022. So what are we talking about here, Smoo?
2% increase. It could be one of two things. I'm sorry that I have to do this, but it can be set for the third quarter. It could be at first. No, let me put it this way. At first, I thought it would be retail sales because retail sales had gone down by 1.2%. Then set to go up, I think, by 2%, maybe. But now that you're mentioning it, I think this is the GDP. I think that's the GDP number.
Congratulations, smooth, spot on. And yeah, so the story is that South Africa's GDP is set for a near 2% increase in the third quarter of 2022. So seasonally adjusted manufacturing production increased by 1.9% in the third quarter compared to a 2.8% decrease in the second quarter. Meanwhile, the largest positive contributors to manufacturing production were the motor vehicles and transport sector, which contributed 1.9%, food and beverages contributing just under 1%, and basic iron and steel, which contributed 0.8%. Meanwhile, seasonally adjusted mining production increased by 2.2% in the third quarter, following a 0.2% increase in the second quarter. And the largest positive contributors to mining production were gold, which contributed 1.3%, diamonds contributing 0.9%, and coal contributing 0.8%, and manganese ore contributing 0.7%. So there you have it. SA GDP seems likely to see a rebound of 2% in the third quarter of 2022.
Which reinforces the fact that South Africa is still a mining town, is still a mining country.
Most definitely, and I think, despite the poor performance of our mining sector, they have benefited from the rebound in commodity prices. Obviously, looking at the biggest contributors being gold, diamonds, etc. Given the high levels of uncertainty, gold prices have actually been soaring. And there's this sort of unspoken rule in economics that you can usually tell by the indicator of two commodities which way the economy is going. So it's either platinum, when the productive economy and real economic growth is strong, that platinum prices go up above gold prices. But in cases of uncertainty and global recession, it's usually the price of gold which goes up and exceeds that of platinum as people look for stores of value as opposed to being invested in the economic growth cycle that we're faced with. So given where the commodities are going in this state, we seemingly are still not through this period of total uncertainty, given everything that's up in the air with, the truce on the US-China trade war, the Ukraine-Russia conflict that continues to unfold, the global energy crisis that we faced, etc. And I would worry that, this 2% reprieve that we're expecting for the third quarter is definitely going to be reversed given what we have in the current months in terms of load shedding severity and the production losses and economic losses associated with that.
And this week, the South African Reserve Bank is expected to raise the repo rate once again, just before the holiday season.
It's almost a foregone conclusion given that the US Fed just increased by 75 basis points, and there's speculations that the December MPC of the US Fed is likely to raise rates by an additional 100 basis points in December. So I'm expecting a 75 to 100 basis points increase by the Reserve Bank in South Africa later this week.
Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah, good one.
On that note, that brings an end to the episode for this month.